Thank you very much, Leslie and Omar. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to give this lecture at Cooper. And I guess first I'd like to express thanks as well to the Art School and the Robert Lehman Foundation. So I shall begin. Maybe I'll just say something quickly about the term somatology. I realized not many people might be familiar with the word. It's not a neologism. It's actually used in medical practice, but I'm not going to talk about its medical dimension. It's just a reference to the Greek soma for body and logos for speech. So speech about the body, basically, is what the title suggests. Yeah. Okay. So this lecture may be somewhat, I guess, academic, but I hope that the themes will be broad enough to engage a diversity of interests. So my concern in this lecture is to explore an approach to the description of spatiality that takes as its point of departure our corporeal being, what we might term an ontology of the body. The issues at stake have wide implications, and I would like to touch on one of these, whose relation to contemporary inquiries into the status of the natural world and the politics of ecology is fundamental, but not obvious and often overlooked. The matter pertains to the question of the status of ethnography as a method for understanding concrete practices. The ethnographic method has been incorporated into other branches of inquiry, leaving its original disciplinary domain of anthropology to be applied to other contexts, including the study of scientific communities, such as Bruno Latour's classic work on the biological laboratories of the Salk Institute, very important work of modern architecture, actually. So I would like in this lecture to step back into the traditional domain of anthropology and to suggest both a provisional genealogy of this generalization of ethnographic method, where anthropologists go physically to study societies, and to inquire into the phenomenological conditions that make ethnography possible. So I offer a disclaimer in advance. Clearly, I'm not an anthropologist, but I believe that the discipline is unique because it is the only domain of scientific inquiry in which pre-colonial worlds presence themselves out of historical structural necessity. Anthropology is a discipline that cannot be emancipated from coloniality, which is both its shame and its promise. I'm an architect with an interest in spatiality, the obvious concern of my discipline. At the lowest level of experience, before entering into questions about design, technology, and so forth, spatiality opens horizons of communication constituted by the sheer facticity of bodily being. It is at this level, the layer of corporeity, where the phenomenological problem of spatiality in architecture and the ethnographic imperative for bodily presence in anthropology fuse. I will present in this lecture the background to a method for developing a phenomenological interpretation of the experience of spatiality that is in dialogue with ethnography, and an example of the working out of such a method in relation to a concrete spatial practice. The lecture is divided into 4 parts. I begin introducing the primary anthropological and philosophical references and propose a provisional genealogy for a normative disposition of empathy toward the other that characterizes contemporary anthropology. In part 2, I explore the thesis of anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, a British anthropologist, on the methodological priority of ethnography. and I try to limit the problem to descriptions of spatiality. In the third part, I present the phenomenological thesis as it relates to ethnography as a critical practice before developing a more specific analysis of the relation between the ethnographic theory of corporeity of Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveres de Castro and the phenomenology of corporeal experience by the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka. I end with a short extract describing the corporeal constitution of the spatiality of a ritual in Brazil, drawing on my own fieldwork. If the cosmos is saturated with humanity, why is this metaphysical ether opaque? Or why is it, at best, like a two-way mirror, returning an image of the human from only one of its sides? These questions grant us access to the Amerindian concept of the body. They also make it possible for us to pass from the quasi-epistemological notion of perspectivism to a veritable ontological one, multinaturalism, Eduardo Viveres de Castro. Perception and the entire original givenness of the content of the natural world are essentially linked with corporeal life. Life in the natural world is a corporeal life. The natural world is essentially an oriented, perspectival, situational world, Jan Patočka. These quotes, drawn from two different disciplines, anthropology and philosophy, are both concerned with the problem of corporeity. In spite of the significant differences that separate them, both passages point to the intertwining of the concept of nature and that of the body. They indicate by extension approaches to the conception of spatiality. Eduardo Viveres de Castro is a Brazilian anthropologist whose work is on the society and cosmology of indigenous communities in Amazonia. His monograph, published in English as From the Enemy's Point of View, is a major work of contemporary ethnography. It is to a significant extent the ethnographic basis focused on the Arawate, a people of eastern Amazonia of the Tupi-Guarani language family, of his later theoretical speculations on the conceptual worlds of indigenous peoples, what he would qualify as an epistemology termed perspectivism and an ontology termed multinaturalism. In summary, perspectivism is the name that Viveres de Castro gives to a generally observed and recorded Amerindian animistic tendency to understand the differentiated nature of the world as a function of the specific differences of the corporeal constitution of all entities, similarly ensouled as persons, human, non-human animal, plants, etc. Through specific ritual and instrumental means, certain persons, namely shamans, are able to transgress corporeal limits and exist as interspecific beings, in the sense of species, simultaneously human and non-human, thereby gaining the perspective of others, including animals, divine beings, and the dead. This potential for interspecificity means that the shaman can inhabit multiple points of view on nature, and therefore multiple natures, insofar as the body expresses nature as a world constitution. Multinaturalism thus follows logically and ontologically from perspectivism. Nature, therefore, is not an objective category over against subjective culture, but is the concrete experience of world, in terms of what Viveres de Castro characterizes as a phenomenological quality. Viveres de Castro develops the theoretical implications for his ethnography explicitly in a collection of essays published under the provocative title Cannibal Metaphysics. This Amerindian metaphysics is essentially an ontology. Whereas de Castro's theoretical elaboration of this ontology, as he qualifies it, is complex. But before elaborating further, I propose to situate it within a provisional genealogy of ethnological, theoretical projects concerned with the conceptual worlds of indigenous peoples. Whereas de Castro was a student of Claude Lévi-Strauss, the founder of structural anthropology and a seminal figure in the development of structuralism as a theoretical paradigm. In many ways, Whereas de Castro inherited an earlier project of Lévi-Strauss to investigate the conceptual worlds of indigenous peoples of the Americas in general, presented programmatically in his text, The Savage Mind. The idea of savage thought in Lévi-Strauss indicates the thesis of a relationship between concrete practices and the formation of concepts. Lévi-Strauss articulates this relationship in terms of the phenomenon named totemism, a dyadic concept that is dependent for its meaning on a binary opposition between nature and culture. As Philippe Descola, French anthropologist, points out, Lévi-Strauss does not prioritize the question of the ontological status of the relations of identity, affinity, and difference that he thematizes. That the totem is specific implies more radically the question of the relationship between corporeal presence, animal, plant, territory, etc., and conceptual structure. It is this ontological dimension of the problem of concept formation that Whereas de Castro would take up. So what is important to note in this development from the epistemological concerns of Lévi-Strauss to the ontological theme in Whereas de Castro is a shift in the disposition of the anthropologist, which exemplifies an ethical reorientation of anthropology as a whole. So I would like to suggest that it is one of the conditions of possibility for the more recent transformation and application of anthropological methods as a whole, and specifically ethnographic fieldwork and ethnography, for the purpose of developing an analysis of modernity in general. The emblematic figure of this general methodological tendency toward an analytic of the anthropology of the moderns that understands its task in relation to a thesis of ontological equivalence and symmetry between the categories of nature and culture as an inquiry into modes of existence is perhaps Bruno Latour. This Latour could be said to have instituted through his seminal study with Steve Wolger on the scientific laboratory, and specifically the biological laboratory, as the radical subject for an ethnographic inquiry into the co-constitution of scientific community and biological fact. It is indicative of what Congolese philosopher Valentin Mudimbe terms Einfühlung, a German term that Mudimbe inherits from phenomenology, signifying broadly empathy toward the other, which also turns out to be a form of empathy toward the self as other. Its extra-disciplinary origin in the form of an explicit project following Mudimbe's thesis would be the seminal and controversial work by Belgian Franciscan missionary Placide France Tempels, titled Bantu Philosophy, first published in 1945. Bantu philosophy is arguably the first ethnological and theological attempt to identify, extract, and elaborate a systematic conceptual framework from the practices and knowledge forms of societies that would traditionally have been both the objects and subjects of colonial violence, missionary zeal, and anthropological curiosity. The flaws of this work are many. for it is implicated in all three aforementioned historical forms of violence. For Mudimbe, and here I follow his lead, what Bantu philosophy opened is a disposition of empathy that is founded on the situation of being there in person, in the flesh, with the other. If Malinowski, early 20th century anthropologist, established this condition as a methodological foundation for anthropology, that is, the priority of ethnographic fieldwork, Tempels instituted a theoretical orientation that, when taken over by the discipline of anthropology proper, would open the possibility for engaging the ideality of the other from an ethical plane of empathy. Ethnographic fieldwork and description, therefore, would constitute not merely a method, but a theoretical orientation normatively constituted as an empathetic disposition. In her multidisciplinary study of Melanesian society titled Property, Substance, and Effect, British anthropologist Marilyn Strathern begins with a reflection on the methodological significance of ethnographic fieldwork and its relation to ethnographic description as a discursive practice oriented in advance by a theoretical motivation. The theoretical conditions that orient ethnographic description imply profound problems tied to the historicity of anthropology, not merely as a scientific field, but as a discipline enmeshed in political and economic histories of violence. What is important to note is that the discipline is not naive with respect to its own historicity and addresses this through general normative principles of reflexivity, recursivity, and empathy. The theoretical intent implicit in the task of writing is affected by the concrete conditions encountered in the field. Strathern notes, it is significant that immersement in the field immersement is repeated in the subsequent study away from the field. Ethnographers set themselves the task not just of comprehending the effect that certain practices and artifacts have in people's lives, but of recreating some of those effects in the context of writing about them. The effect of engaging the fields together, we might term the ethnographic moment. Oops. Ethnography implies a double movement, the experience of the field in person and the activity of writing. The writing, Strathern notes, quote, only works as an imaginative recreation of some of the effects of fieldwork itself, end quote. The ethnographic moment, therefore, as a point of intersection and overlap between being present in the field and writing about the field, is based in part on the effects of fieldwork, what Strathern thus calls the ethnographic effect. Further, this effect has a totalizing character which, as an experiential condition, is simultaneously partial. The ethnographer experiences a paradoxical tension of being wholly immersed in the situation in the field, yet not completely yielding to this very claim of total commitment to the moment. The temporal distance that both unites and separates the experience of the field and that of writing is the site in which this tension is worked over. Strathern, quoting Annalise Riles, describes this moment as a figure seen twice. I want to dwell on this first sighting, the moment of totalizing immersement that is at the same time paradoxically partial, what Strathern terms the effect of being dazzled. She states, movement between fields is only part of the flexibility of the ethnographic method. The paradox is that flexibility of a kind lies also in the very state of immersement, in the totalizing as well as partial nature of commitment, my emphasis. In yielding to the preoccupation of others, the field worker enters into relationships with people for which no amount of imagining or speculating can serve as advanced preparation. The traditional understanding of the ethnographic field proper points to the necessity of the actual presence of the ethnographer in the same physical space and time as the subjects of study. This is the empirical basis of any claims to knowledge and truth that the anthropologist could make, and is a methodological cornerstone of the discipline. This requirement for spatial co-presence in the mutual temporal present is what anthropologist Johannes Fabian refers to as coevalness. It demands that the contemporaneity and synchronicity of the other be taken seriously. But it is quite difficult to analyze the conditions that surround and penetrate this mutual presence of one to the other in the common present. This is the case because the actuality of the situation has already elapsed, and the analytic or reflective gaze has already slipped into redundancy with respect to the concreteness of the situation. Strathern characterizes this moment of elapsed time in which the ethnographer is immersed in the event as something like a surplus. The theoretical intentions that motivate fieldwork could not possibly anticipate the totality of conditions in the field that assert a claim on the ethnographer. Strathern, as an anthropologist, is primarily concerned with problems of sociality and relationality at the level of the social. I propose, however, to dwell on the more general methodological problem of the totalizing nature of ethnographic situations and the phenomenon of immersement in terms of more rudimentary analyses, those of the immediacy of spatial and corporeal co-presence. This I propose as a point of entry into the phenomenological problems of ethnographic method. The mutuality of time and space that characterizes ethnographic situations such that anyone who is there in person can be certain that she is there together with others within a physical environment is mutually founded on aesthesis, on sense perception. Therefore, any attempt to interpret the situation in any aspect must have, whether explicitly made thematic or not, as its methodological basis an assumption about the nature of sense perception. The issue does not rest here, but let us consider ethnography's relation as a consequence to a phenomenology of perception. In a way analogous to anthropology, description is of basic methodological significance for phenomenological research. The precise nature of the object to be described, however, is not straightforward, nor is the descriptive method as a consequence. The premise is deceptively simple, that things appear always in relation to some simultaneously appearing environmental context, to some perceiving subject, for whom something like appearance is possible. Insofar as the perceiving subject is corporeal, she also appears to herself, bodily and environmentally. The subject need not be a human being. Environmental body cells and other bodies appear for non-human animals, plants, and phenomenologist Husserl proposes even single-cell organisms. The experience of the perception of the bodily presence of things, of environments, and of corporeal self-presence and the corporeality of others are forms of object appearances that phenomenology aims to describe in their manner of appearing. Although these are not the only forms, the other type is that of the appearance of subjectivity itself, and the fundamental problematic that arises in relation to the description of the appearance of subjectivity to itself is that of historicity and the temporal constitution of the world. But let us start with the problem of the objectively appearing world, which is none other than the problem of the structure and experience of spatiality and corporeity, which a phenomenology of sense perception claims to clarify. One of the earliest attempts at the systematic elaboration of corporeal experience in the phenomenological tradition is the habilitation thesis of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, titled The Natural World as a Philosophical Problem, completed in 1936, almost a decade before the publication of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. Patočka's influence in architecture specifically has been a function of the work of the late Czech architect and theorist Dalibor Veselý. Patočka himself was a student of Phenomenology's founder Edmund Husserl, and his thesis displays a remarkable fidelity to Husserl's original project for phenomenology. For Patočka, subjectivity is ontologically corporeal. Bodily being is a condition of possibility for the subjective experience of an appearing world. It is therefore only as a body subject that the ethnographer can experience the situation of the field. Patočka proposes further that our understanding is bodily accommodated, a point noted by Karel Novotný. This idea is already anticipated in Husserl through his description of bodily kinesthesis as that which directs our attention to our facility for apprehending phenomena. And this facility has the character of being governed by fiat. I experience my body in advance as understanding how to move before I can make movement an explicit theme for understanding. In fact, it is largely in contrived conditions or situations of discomfort that I make my bodily movement an explicit theme. It is not that the ethnographer is immersed as if under a spell, enchanted by discourse as truth. Her body as subject is already beforehand accommodating possibilities for understanding. And if at any moment her body itself becomes a theme for her, she has broken free in advance from claims of involvement, and thus the entire situation becomes objectified in a wholly different manner, as a moment of alienation. Phenomenological descriptions of perception, bodily kinesthesis, and environmental constitution, especially within the Husserlian tradition, is technical in its language and slow in its unfolding. It also requires certain basic conceptual and methodological reorientations that appear counterintuitive. Because the descriptive problem is typically explored in terms of the perception of the visible spatial world, its fundamental thesis on the temporality of spatial experience is easily missed. The essential target of a phenomenological account of the experience of spatiality is not space as such, but is rather the temporality, generativity, and historicity of perception. The material composition of the objectified world is not the primary target of phenomenological accounts of corporeity and spatiality. Even if we are considering massive geographic or geologic territories, or even the relationship between cosmic bodies as so-called hyperobjects, the objectified substantiality of the world, the question of the world as supposedly already having come to an end, and its newly proposed horizonlessness as networks of material substances. For example, the polemic of Timothy Morton, or even certain assertions by Latour, are theses. As long as temporality, generativity, in the sense of generational continuities and discontinuities of world experience, and historicity remain in the background, the conception of spatiality and corporeity implied in an anthropology of modernity based on a substantial and purely immanent conception of objectivity risks being dogmatic. And the methodological and ethical imperative for empathy that ethnographic description confronts us with is closed off in advance. For ethnography to function as an ethical practice, it requires ontological resistance on the part of the subjects of study. Ethnographic fieldwork and its consequential description are not neutral methods. The concrete ethnographic example with which we started is drawn from the Amazonian anthropology of Eduardo Viveres de Castro. What is particularly striking about Viveres de Castro's study of Amazonian society, for our purposes, is the close attention that he pays to the phenomenon of corporeity, that the significance of the description and the significance of the description of its experience among the Tupi-Guarani not merely as a methodological premise, but as an ontological condition. The theoretical proposition that Viveres de Castro is putting forward implies more than the thesis of a Tupi-Guarani metaphysics, but more fundamentally that the phenomena described ethnographically are ontologically true. That is, that they are. The becoming jaguar of the shaman, or the becoming the enemy of the warrior, is not a concept in the epistemological sense tied to the Western philosophical tradition, but the true constitution of a world. The problem of an encounter with the truth of the ontological horizon of the Amerindian societies, Viveres de Castro's ethnography indicates, I propose, can be addressed in part phenomenologically. The relationship between the concept of the body and that of perspective, Viveres de Castro states succinctly as follows. What I call body is an assemblage of affects or ways of being that constitute a habitus. Between the formal subjectivity of souls and the substantial materiality of organisms, there is thus an intermediate plane which is occupied by the body as a bundle of affects and capacities, and which is the origin of perspectives. Precisely what is meant by assemblage of affects, habitus, bundle of affects and capacities, and so forth must be explored and clarified. Viveres de Castro's approach to this problem is to draw on the idea of clothing and the notion of equipment, which he grounds ethnographically in terms of ritual performance and the bodily articulation and dress that characterize it. Ritual involves clothing the human in animal masks, which function to metamorphosize humans into these animals. The transformation is neither representational nor merely symbolic, but affective, in the sense that the capacities and powers realizable in potential as a function of the animal's corporeal constitution become available to the human as animal body. Although Viveres de Castro uses the notion of the body as a tool, his concept of metamorphosis as performative is not merely instrumental. The human cum animal is a subjectivity with a particularized point of view, because the transformation of the body is at the same time an ontological transformation of the world. I propose here to linger on this theme of the body as bundle of affects and capacities that function in terms of the potentiality inherent in the body's physiognomy. In speaking of affects and capacities, Viveres de Castro is implying the body's human and non-human inherent aesthetic and kinesthetic structuring of its movement and perception, and the relation of this to some environmental horizon. This theme takes us directly to Patočka's notion of corporeal or embodied subjectivity and its kinestheses, which he frames in terms of the concept of subjective movement. The body's aesthetic, kinesthetic dispositions imply particular capabilities and potentialities as positioned in relation to some context. This positionality and power to perform kinesthetically is indicative of, if not a habitus in the full sense that implies a personal history and memory, at the very least a habituality or tendency toward something. Patočka describes the situation as follows. A tendency can be satisfied only by a subject through the direct active contact with its surroundings that is the agency of all our activities. These are our kinestheses, the movements that subsequently provide the ground for the apperception of our own bodiliness. An animal subject is a priori possible only as bodily. life in kinesthesis is among the most important moments of the constitution of the objective world. In terms of a descriptive understanding of the body as apperceptive kinesthetic, Patočka posits a concept of subjectivity that opens the possibility for the constitution of one's objective world. Patočka is suggesting that the corporeity and spatiality of the environment has affective power to provoke in the subject a desire for spatial and situational apprehension. The passive being affected by contains within it an active desire that can be taken up intentionally, but is beforehand orienting a horizon of possibilities. The orientation is as much temporal and historical as it is spatial. For example, I am in a room and I hear multiple conversations in multiple languages simultaneously, but I am drawn to the language that I understand, passively at first, which I may then actively take up and listen in on the conversation. Or I sit in my study and a shadow flickers across my window in the shape of a person. I am drawn to the image and walk to the window, only to realize that it was the shadow of a tree branch swayed by the wind. In the former example, we are already dealing with the historicity of language. In the latter, the unfolding of the perceptual experience of the shadow can be seen as a temporal process of clarifying an initially opaque perception to arrive at the evidence of the tree and wind, and thus the truth of the percept. I propose that both Veros de Castro's ethnography and the body, and Patočka's phenomenology of corporeity are examples of what I term somatological descriptions. Veros de Castro's argument is for ontological plurality. It could not be, however, that Amerindian being is wholly categorically different from modern being. Otherwise, Veros de Castro's ethnography would not be possible. Nor could it be that modernity has accomplished a total ontological flattening of world experience. Clearly, there is ontological difference, as Veros de Castro's ethnography indicates, but that this difference appears such that it can be objectified through ethnographic research, whose method demands the presence in the flesh of the ethnographer to the subject of study. The method rests on lower-level assumptions about the ethnographer's embodied subjectivity, her aesthetic, kinesthetic possibilities for being oriented in the spatial environment she finds herself in, communicative possibilities at the level of bodily gesture she has with other embodied subjects, human and non-human, and the sedimentations of historical experience that give temporal depth to the situation. And there is discourse. These conditions I would describe, extending Strathern's concept, as the temporality, generativity, and historicity of the ethnographic moment, as fundamentally a moment of embodied spatial experience. And it is precisely the significance of the corporeity and spatiality of experience that I am after. So in the final part of the lecture, I draw on my own fieldwork, my own research, to offer a concrete example of a phenomenological ethnographic description of spatiality. The ethnographic context is a ritual in the city of Salvador in the Brazilian Northeast. The ritual is called the Candomblé Caboclo Reunião, or meeting. Candomblé, as described by Brazilian anthropologist Marcio Goldman, quote, is one of the many Brazilian religions that display elements of African origins. Probably formed from the 19th century onwards, Candomblé also embodies, to different degrees, elements of Native American practices and cosmologies, as well as that of popular Catholicism and European Spiritism, end quote. A caboclo, in the ritual context, is a term indicating an indigenous presence. The particular caboclo toward which the ritual was oriented was named Tupiniquim, described to me as the spirit of an indoctrinated Amerindian who would have spoken a Tupi-Guarani language. The ritual takes place in a room of a house located in the city's periphery, headed by a woman called a Mãe de Santo, or Mother of Saint. Tupiniquim manifests himself in as the body of the Mãe de Santo. The ritual event is referred to in Portuguese as a reunião, a word that is, in its most everyday sense, means meeting. I will use the Portuguese word reunião in reference to the event. Many of the participants are women called filhas de santo, or daughters of saint. The reunião involves certain acts of blessing, or in Portuguese, abençoar, to bless, and bençaos, blessings. So a basic glossary would be reunião, Mãe de Santo, filhas de santo, abençoar, bençaos. The following description will be supplemented by my photographic documentation, and I was not allowed to document Tupiniquim's manifestation. Everyone, for the most part, is dressed in white. It appears that the very act of changing clothes is significant. The woman's clothing is particularly elaborate. The full-length white dress or blouse and skirt, typically frilled and patterned closest to the body, and the white wrap of cloth that covers this primary layer at the torso, up to the chest and extending just above the knees, where the fabric is at times ornate with embroidery. In addition to the actual clothing, there is the marking of the body with a gritty, scented powder, typically as follows: the forehead, the wrists, marked with a cross, the palms with a small circle, and the top of the bare feet with a cross, the chest, close to the neck with a cross, and the nape with an asterisk-like shape. The act of dressing ends in a mist of perfume, a total incensing that qualifies the speciality of the reunião. With the burning of incense, the whole space is enlivened in an extraordinary way. Everything and everyone is fragranced. The smoke is ubiquitous. The filha de santo who performs the incensing holds with her arm outstretched a simple metal censer, through which she bathes the room in smoke and its diffuse light. It is in terms of the censer that the ritual, as a community in dialogue, first shows itself amidst the haze. Everyone orients themselves toward the censer, and through various gestures of drawing the smoke toward their bodies, are in communion with each other and with the one holding the censer, her motion itself determined by the task of perfuming. This implicit reference to Catholic rite will be made transparent through prayer when all are around the table. The room is thick with the perfumed smoke of incense. It appears that the act of incensing functions as a kind of threshold, instituting the beginning of the reunião. The incensation does not take place, for the most part, until after the room is decorated and the clothing is changed. There is a general sense, therefore, of the priority of dressing, of ornamenting the room and the body in readiness for the occasion of the reunião. The woman who carries the censer dresses herself and is dressed in white with necklaces prior to taking up the censer. Her clothing becomes a theme in the very basic sense that it is something explicit toward which her actions and therefore her body is oriented. The moment she takes up the censer, her clothes are no longer thematic for her. The censer itself is a simple cylindrical tin with a long metal wire handle. The filha de santo holds it in her outstretched arm and swings the censer as she circles the room, anti-clockwise starting from the north wall. The room filled with the perfumed smoke such that the air thickens. Over against the objective quality of things in the room, we have the ephemeral objectivity of smoke, such that we no longer have a picture of anything, like the experience of walking through a dense fog. But unlike a fog, here it is precisely the smoke that becomes what is sought after. This is clear from the gestures of people. They wave their hands and lift their arms and turn their bodies in such a way as to draw the smoke towards them. They precisely do not walk through the smoke, but are oriented towards it through these gestures that bring it close. But the smoke is its very ephemerality. As quickly as it is had, it is gone. Once it has been had, when the body has been completely perfumed, it is truly gone in terms of its purpose and can itself become a visual spectacle, a picture. At the end, the Filia Gisanto incenses her own body, making present again to herself her clothes, and we know that the reunião has begun. With the Mãe de Santo and others seated around the table, the reunião typically begins as all present recite the Lord's Prayer and the Ave Maria. After the prayers have been recited a few times, everyone present claps in an evidently prescribed way. The palms are arched and crossed so that a low, deep tone resounds when they clasp. The rhythm is somewhat fragmented. 2 slow claps, followed by 3 or 4 more rapid ones, a pause, then a final clap, after which the pattern is repeated. The entire gesture is oriented downward through the subtle movement and positioning of the body as a whole. We will come to see this clapping gesture called pau again shortly. Here it seems to mark an interstice between the prayers and the singing that will follow. After the prayers, everyone in the room begins to sing and mark the rhythm of the songs with clapping in the more typical sense, that is, as a rhythmic accompaniment. As these words are chanted, those around the table, individually and in turns, begin to greet the Mãe de Santo in an elaborate and structured manner. I will use the Filia de Santo who performed the incensing as an example. Her place at the table is at the right of the Mãe de Santo. During the singing, she leaves her seat and first addresses the entrances, or more precisely, the thresholds. The door to the Mãe de Santo's room, the gate at the stair, the opening to the deck outside, the door to the shrine, by bending and touching the ground before the entrances with her right hand, then with this hand touching her forehead and the back of her head. She then greets those around the table by gently touching the palms of their hands with hers, as they both say, abençoar, bless you. Finally, she greets the Mãe de Santo in the following way. Kneeling at the head of the table, with the Mãe de Santo sitting, they embrace. The Filia de Santo then lies on the ground, her body outstretched, first on one side, with her head resting on clasped hands, then repeating the gesture on the other. She lies then on her front, bringing her palms to her forehead, and repeats the gesture of the clap or pau that we encountered, before lying prostrate before the Mãe de Santo. In the latter position, the Mãe de Santo gently touches her back with her right hand, making a cross. The ritual itself has beforehand established for us the ground as a thesis. We are merely following this phenomenal thread reflectively. It is clear that the entrances, and specifically the floor at the entrances, for the Filia de Santo could have addressed the lintel, for example, become preeminent sites during the abençoa or blessing greeting. The floor at the entrances is in this manner posited through the gesture described. The gesture is thetic, this term used in the simplest sense, implying merely orientation. Behind what may be the express symbolic value of the thresholds, the gestures reveal the orientation of the ritual performance within the horizon of the abençoa greeting. The entrance thresholds were always there, but now they are made present explicitly in the form of a prescribed gesture that links them through the right hand to the head. Within the context of the ritual action, they form the necessary antecedent to the communal act of exchanging bençaos, blessings. In addressing the thresholds, the floor is expressly touched with the hands in a similar way as the palms of those around the table were, for example. It is the floor itself as some significance that is brought to attention. With the gesture of prostration, however, this is not the case. At all times, the attention is directed toward the Mais de Santo by means of the floor. This even when the Filia de Santo is face down. But as a secondary telos, that is quite literally a horizontal level that affords the gesture of prostration, the floor is not addressed, but rather it is belabored, it is worked. The working of the floor is precisely the gesture of prostration as it unfolds as a technique oriented toward the accomplishment of bençaos. Already in this situation, we're dealing with a technological problem. The labor that accomplishes the blessings is most clearly shown by one of the men who, crouched on his knees and elbows, drew his body until his posture was literally horizontal. The telos of the horizontality of the body was the same for the Filia de Santo, whose preparatory work seemed less laborious, that is, resting her weight on one side, then the next, before actual prostration. In this position, the Mais de Santo would complete the bençao by crossing the back of the Filia de Santo, that is, bending to touch with her hands, like the manner in which the Filia de Santo had bent before to touch the floor at the thresholds. Whatever may be the symbolic meaning, reverence, or submission, we have witnessed in the unfolding of the abençoa greeting a historicity rooted in the phenomenon of the greeting itself. In quite a literal way, the lowest horizon of the room, the horizontal level of the floor, becomes a preeminent presence to the extent that in the end, the body of the Filia de Santo is horizontal like the floor. This dynamic temporal unfolding of the abençoa greeting is historical in a fundamental sense. The first instituting orthetic act was addressing the floor at the thresholds, an act that in fact was already anticipated by the song in terms of the unfolding of a prescribed and thus already anticipated technique or manner of enactment. This aspect of the réunion ended with the accomplishment of the thesis in the basic sense of an orientation, the crossing of the back on the prostrate body in blessing. Without asserting the symbolic meaning explicitly, we have been shown by the unfolding of the phenomenon itself that there is a prescribed horizon of meaning, an institution determined by the telos of bençaos that is to be technically accomplished. If ultimately the floor is a belabored background for the accomplishment of the institution of blessing, the description that I offer is a foregrounding of an architectural horizon, the ground, that was worked not for its own sake, but for the sake of the réunion. After blessings and everyone is again seated, the Mais de Santo leads the recital of the Lord's Prayer and the Ave Maria. During the prayer, Tupiniquim arrives, the indigenous entity. His arrival initiates a remarkable transformation, not only of the Magisanto, but of the entire topos. The prayers are recited solemnly in the Catholic posture of clasped hands and bowed heads. At a certain point in the recitation of the prayers, the Magisanto stops praying and begins to rub her forehead, typically removing her spectacles. At the table on her left side sits the Ikeje, her assistant in the praxis of the ritual, who, though praying, has her eye on the Magisanto. In a sense, everyone does in general anticipation. Tupinikim's arrival is marked by a certain visibly physical violence, in the sense of a transgression. The Magisanto's entire body shakes once, it seems, yet it is as though only her head moves in an instant, a sudden jolt. In the instant, which is understood by all, the lights are switched off and only the flicker of the candle's light remains. The instant that marks the arrival of Tupinikim introduces for us a methodological difficulty because it appears to be totally concrete, like a kind of death. By concreteness, I'm referring to the phenomenon as an instantaneous event that is, by itself, in a certain way, complete, expressed by the jolt of the Magisanto and complemented by the switching off of the lights. We appear to be here at an edge, a seam. We have approached this edge from one direction, such that our understanding is already prejudiced in favor of this instant as a telos. But clearly it is transgressed, and the reunião continues, or we could say begins qualitatively anew. In the latter sense, this instant marks a genesis. The methodological difficulty lies in the status of the instant as an apparently autonomous whole that does not seem to have a temporal and thus perceptual unfolding, like the Bensaus, for example. This instantaneity makes phenomenological clarification difficult. The visual texture of the whole scene, the adorned table surrounded by the whiteness of clothing and lit by flickering candles against the lush blackness of night, is evocative of a Caravaggio, Supper at Emmaus. My reference to the painting is not merely visual. Rather, I'm drawing a parallel with the instantaneous, revelatory essence of the event that it depicts. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. It is the obscure temporality, or even atemporality, of the jolt of the body of the Magisanto, which at the same time inaugurated her absence, that speaks to the narrative of Christ's vanishing. The fundamental difference, however, is the persistence of the body of the Magisanto come Tupinikim, and the transformation of the whole scene into the unequivocal appearance of the head of the table as preeminent. Within the horizon of the event of Tupinikim having Shego, arrived, it is also unequivocal that he is bodily present in the flesh. Thank you very much. Selassie.